Hello and welcome. We are going to be talking about config files here today, as well as creating a Python function for reading those config files and returning the information that you're actually looking for. So I've got two files open here. They're both in the same working directory called demos here. So you can see that I have a db file and a conf.ini file. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to set up a conf file. And if you're not familiar with an ini file or a config file, it's a format for saving information that typically has to do with something related to the project that the file is in that folder for. This could be things like credentials. You could save credentials into that file and then chmod that file so that nobody else could access that on your file system. You could have references to the usernames, passwords, or you could have things like port numbers or URL addresses or things like that. So it very handy for building things like maybe a MySQL connection string for connecting to a MySQL server or anything like those, like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with actually building our CNF file or our INI file. And typically you're going to have some kind of default connection as part of your file. And what we can see, what we'll do here is we'll create this default, and this refers to which information. And I'm going to be using like a user login at this point, and we're going to have a username, which is going to be something, and then we're going to have a password, which is going to be something as well. And this is going to be our default username and password. And then we're going to have another section that is going to have something like GitHub, and this will have our GitHub username and our GitHub password. And I'm not actually going to put a real username and password in here, but this will give us a sense of how to create a config file that will allow us to save this information in there, and then we can read it off of a Python script. So in this case, we've got the default, we've got GitHub, and we need to provide a username and a password. So what we're going to do is we're going to say Caleb, and we're going to say Caleb123, a very, very secure password, as you can clearly see. This one is going to be clever Caleb, and we'll say more clever 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we're going to save this as our config file, and the next step is that we want to write a Python script that will read this, and we'll be able to say, okay, I want the username and password for default or for GitHub, and the function that we're going to build is going to accept simply GitHub or default, and it will send back the username and password combination. So it'll send back a tuple of username and password combination. So in this case, we're going to throw in. We're going to import config parser. We're also going to import pathlib. Okay, and we're using pathlib to get the current file's location, and the current file's location is important because if these are going to be in the same folder, we want to be able to use that. Now we could also modify it so that it's looking in a particular location. You could set it in your home directory, for example, and then it's only going to read from your system's home directory. There are lots of different ways that you could set that up, really. So in this case, let's start with the config portion, the config parser portion of this. So we're going to, we've already imported config parser. We're going to say that we have a config is going to be config parser.config parser, and we're going to read the file. So this is going to be config.read And what we're going to be using is this conf.ini. Okay, and we're just going to start off by printing out what that looks like. So db is going to look like this. So we've got this configparser object. And what's really nice about configparser is that we can have these sections that we can look at. So sections like this. There we go. So we have GitHub, and the default actually doesn't show up automatically in this sections there. However, we can reference that as something that we can look for. So print config default. Okay, and this is our default section right there. So default isn't going to show up if we just print out the sections. It's the default section, and instead we have GitHub is one. And what we can do from here is now we can retrieve the username that we had. And so there's the clever username Caleb, or we can do the password. Okay, Caleb123. Right. So we're printing out those config sections. Now what we're going to do is we're going to define a function here that we're going to just say get user pass, and we've got a some kind of input string or section, we'll call it, because that's the section we're going to be retrieving, the section of the config file. And our current working directory, which we'll say cwd, is going to be based off of this pathlib option here. So in this case, we've got pathlib, and that is going to be pathlib.path path with underscore file, or underscore file, dot parent dot absolute. Okay, and what this will do is this will look at what is our current file path, right? What is the current, what's the path reference of this current operating file. We go up one level into the parent working directory and we get that absolute path. So if we print out cwd here, and let's just say get user pass is going to be default, and we run this, this is going to be our full working directory. And so what we're gonna be looking for is a is something like join path with the conf.ini, and then let's print the cwd here again. So this is what it's going to be looking for. So it's going to look for, okay, what's the directory of the file, and let's add the conf.ini file onto the end of that. Okay, so this is going to be our conf file path right there. Okay, and then we read that. So we're going to use basically this information up here. We have the config, and we've got the conf file path right there, and then we can print the config section. Right, so now we have our config section. So let's print that out real quick. There we go, section default. And if we're going to return something, config section, and this is going to be the username, and config section password. Okay, so that's the config section there. So relatively straightforward. Now we get that back. We're not actually printing that. Let's clear that, and let's actually print out the result of that. Okay, so now we get a tuple back, or two items in a tuple that have Caleb and Caleb123, and we can test that this is in fact working by looking at GitHub here, and there we go. Clever Caleb, more clever 123. So we have successfully built a function that will actually go in and look for that username and password and return that. So there you go. That's the goal there. Let's add a little bit of documentation here. This is going to be a string. The default is going to be default. So if you don't pass something in, it's going to use that default value. It's going to be outputting a tuple, and it will have a tuple that is a string and a string. A tuple of two strings, in theory. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to have this file path, and we're going to also throw in here, let's say actually data is going to be config section, and we're going to replace this here, and right there, okay. And what we want to do is we want to say, okay, if we're going to try and do this, but if this section is an invalid section, then what we're going to do is we're going to say except, and in this case, this should be a key error. If this isn't a valid section that you've selected, we're going to raise a key error that is going to say something like invalid section specified must be one of, and then we're going to print out, I guess this is going to be default, and then we're going to have we're going to have the so we want to default, and then we have the join that dot format join config dot sections. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we're going to say we're going to raise a key error, and we're going to say invalid section specified must be one of default, and then the other sections that are available. So let's test this out by saying, instead of GitHub, let's say GitLab. So there we go. Invalid section specified must be one of default. Invalid section specified must be one of default. Interesting. So we're getting invalid section specified. So this is repeating for some reason. Oh, that's because that's a join. This should be a format. There we go. Invalid section specified must be one of default or GitHub, which are our two options. Invalid section, and let's throw in what was actually specified. Okay. And if we're really going to do this correctly, then we should actually use an f string here. Specified must be one of. That, and then we have let's get rid of that. Section specified must be one of default, and then we have that dot join those config sections. There we go. Okay, let's try this again. There we go. So key error, invalid section GitLab specified must be one of default or GitHub. So we actually see what was specified and is in fact invalid. So that's what that should look like. Okay. So we will actually get a helpful key error with a little bit more information on what is in fact available and what was passed in as part of the section. So default is the section, and I think this looks very good. Okay, so now we've got a function that will in fact return what we anticipate it should return. Whether that it will return something by default, or it can return the GitHub information, or it will throw an error if it tries to read something that is not in fact included in our conf.ini file. So with that, I hope this was helpful, hope this was interesting. I certainly use this. This allows me to put different ini files in different locations, or even save one to my root directory, my home directory, and then reference that home directory and say, okay, I'm looking for the permissions that I've set up in that home directory that nobody else can get to, and then I can save that information and reference it later, and have things like connections and stuff like that. So with that, hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, throw those below the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you think that this was helpful. Feel free to share as well if you'd like to. Other than that, though, I will see you in the next video.